So today I'm going to be talking to you about food and beverage marketing directed at children in Canada and in Quebec. And I'm going to basically be answering three questions today. First of all, I'm going to be looking at why this issue is important. Second of all, I'm going to be looking at the quantity of food and beverage advertisements that children in Ontario and Quebec are seeing, also children in Canada, and also how healthful that the food and beverage advertising is. And lastly, I'll be looking at how we can improve the way that we're regulating advertising directed at children. So basically, the starting point, so why this issue is important, is because there have been three systematic reviews of the literature. So three different groups from the UK and also from the United States, the Institute of Medicine, looked at all of the research that had been done in this area, and they came to very similar conclusions. And what they found is that there's a relationship between obesity and food and beverage marketing directed at children, and they also found that there's a relationship between food intake and food and beverage marketing in children. So first of all, they found that commercial food advertising aimed at children directly affects their children's food preferences. It affects their short-term consumption patterns and also their food purchase requests. There was also strong evidence that food marketing directed at children was associated with obesity. Now, childhood obesity in Canada, as you know, has been declared an epidemic in the last couple of years. The current rate of childhood obesity is 26%, so that's 8% obesity, and the rest is overweight. And the highest rates of obesity are in Newfoundland, and the lowest are in Alberta and in Quebec. Now, children's food intake is also not perfect in Canada, far from it. And often the food intake of Canadian children does not meet nutritional guidelines. And this is data again from Statistics Canada from 2004. So fruit and vegetable consumption for children in this age group is low, as is milk consumption. And in terms of snacks, kids are getting 27% of their daily food intake from snack consumption. Also, 22% of calories that are taken in by children between the ages of 4 and 18 are from foods that are not recommended by Canada's Food Guide. So as you can see, we have some work to do here. Now, the policy context in Canada is very, very unique. In Canada, we have the Broadcast Code for Advertising to Children and its code interpretation guidelines, as Janet just described to us. There's also some station-specific policies, like on stations like TV Ontario and CBC, that don't do any marketing to children during certain hours. And then there's the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, again, that Janet described to us, that was developed in 2007 and fully implemented by December 2008. In Quebec, the system is completely different. So in Quebec, the Consumer Protection Act exists. So it was developed in 1978 and it was applied in 1980. And it bans commercial advertising of products that are exclusively designed for children or that appeal to children under the age of 13. And it applies when children consist of 15% of the audience. So here's an example of an advertisement that's directed at children under 13 years of age. And so this is an advertisement that you could not show in Quebec when children consist of 15% of the audience, particularly because it shows, well, it's very directed at the child, obviously. There's a toy in the ad. It's a product for a child. This ad, of course, is allowed in the rest of Canada. So here's an example of an advertisement that's not directed at children under 13 years of age, because it's a man in his office and he's eating a râpe éclair marque, which is some sort of breakfast roll. And anyway, so this ad can be shown when children consist of 15% of the audience in Quebec, because it's not directed at the child, and it's also allowed, obviously, all the time in the rest of Canada. So in terms of the research that has been done in the last few years in Canada in terms of children's exposure to food and beverage marketing, there's only 5 studies really that have been done. 3 that have looked at Ontario and Alberta, and then 2 that have been done in Quebec. And basically, when you look at all these studies all together, the conclusion that we can come to is that there's a high level of food advertising in Canada. So the rate that they found in Ontario was that there were 3 food ads per hour per channel. In Quebec, they found that there were 4 food ads per hour per channel. And in Alberta, they found there were 7 food ads per hour per channel. And Alberta, actually, the study that looked at Alberta and at Ontario, it was a comparison of 11 different countries. And Alberta actually ranked 3rd in the world in terms of the highest food advertising. The other thing that you can see in all of these studies is that the nutritional quality of the foods advertised to children in Canada and in Quebec is poor. Getting to my research, in the last 3 to 4 years, I've been working on 3 different research studies as part of my doctoral thesis. And basically what I've been looking at is the influence of 2 methods of regulating advertising to children. So I was looking at the influence of the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative in Canada, and I was also looking at the influence of the Consumer Protection Act in Quebec. So there were 3 research questions that I was asking. So if you look in the bright colors here down the left-hand side. So in the first study, I was looking at the frequency of food promotions. In the second study, I was looking at the healthfulness of food promotions. And then in the third study, I was looking at both the frequency and healthfulness of food promotions. Now, what I was looking at was the preferred viewing of 3 different groups in the first 2 studies. I was looking at Ontario English kids, Quebec French kids, and Quebec English kids, because those children could be watching different types of TV, they're watching different stations, etc. So in the first 2 studies, I was comparing those 3 groups. In the last study, I had a very different comparison group. I was looking at companies that are participating in the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative and those companies that are not participating in the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. So my abbreviation here is CAI and non-CAI for the corporations that were not participating. Now, in terms of methodology, what we did is we went into 18 schools in Ontario and Quebec. We recruited 428 children between the ages of 10 and 12 years old. First thing we had to do was determine what children's preferred viewing was. So what we did is we gave them a television viewing diary, which they completed for 7 days. So they had this little booklet, and every single time they watched TV, they'd write it in, the time, the date, the station, etc. At the same time as the kids were filling out the television viewing diary, we taped 32 television stations between 6 a.m. and midnight for a 7-day period. Then once we'd collected all this information, what we did is a content analysis, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But in the first and second study, we looked at 90 hours of television programming. So it was kids' preferred viewing. So it was 30 hours for the Ontario English, 30 hours for the Quebec French, and 30 hours for the Quebec English. Their favorite TV shows in that for 30 hours. In the third study, where we were comparing the 2 groups of companies that are either participating in the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative or not participating, we looked at 99.5 hours, and again, it was children's preferred viewing we were looking at. So in terms of what we did for the content analysis, so myself and my research assistant watched a lot of TV one summer, and we looked at the type and length of every food promotion that we saw during that 90 hours of television programming. So what I mean by the type of food promotion, was it an advertisement, so just a regular ad? Was it a contest? Some advertisements are just, the whole thing is just about a contest, and sometimes they can go on for up to 45 seconds. Or was it a sponsorship announcement? That's like when the announcer says, and this show was brought to you by, and then it launches into a commercial of some sort. And sometimes, again, that can last from between 10 seconds to up to 40 seconds. We also looked at the type of food or beverage that was being featured in each promotion, and we looked at the target audience of each promotion. So was that commercial, was it targeting preschoolers, children, teens, was it targeting adults? We also looked at whether there was media characters in the ad. So by media characters, we mean were there licensed characters. Licensed characters are characters like Dora the Explorer or Mickey Mouse that a company has to pay to use in their advertisement. Or was the company using spokes characters? Those are the characters like Tony the Tiger that the company actually owns. Next, we did a nutritional analysis of all the food promotions. So we looked at macronutrients. So macronutrients are looking at things like fat, sugar, carbohydrate, protein, energy, that type of thing. We also looked at the nutrition according to recommendations. And we also did a categorization according to the UK nutrient profile model. And what the UK nutrient profile model is, it's a system that was developed in the UK and validated in the UK about 3 years ago. And the UK uses this model to determine what foods can be advertised to children in the UK. And so what it is, it's a mathematical formula that you plug in all of your nutritional information, how much fat, sugar, sodium, how much protein, what's the nut content, what's the fruit and vegetable content of every food, and it kind of spits out whether the food is considered less healthy or the opposite. And the last thing we did is we did a classification of each advertisement by whether they were advertisements that were done by corporations participating in the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative or those that weren't participating. So in terms of our results, first of all, we were expecting to see big differences with the Quebec French group, which is going to be in red here. And so in terms of just looking at advertisements, we didn't see any differences in the number of advertisements that the Quebec French kids were seeing. So they were seeing as many, it looks like the Quebec English kids are seeing slightly more than the Quebec French, but those differences were not statistically significant. But when we looked at contests and sponsorship announcements that were food and beverage related, we did see a big difference. So the Quebec French group here saw very few food and beverage contests compared to the other two groups and very few sponsorship announcements. When we looked at the target audience of the food and beverage advertisements, if you just look at the numbers I've circled there in red, so that's when children are being targeted. What we found was that children were targeted much more in the Ontario English sample and in the Quebec English sample rather than in the Quebec French sample. But the Quebec French sample was still being targeted quite a bit in their commercials. And we can talk a bit about that maybe in the question period and just issues around monitoring and that type of thing. In terms of media characters, so things like the presence of Tony the Tiger, that type of thing, the use of licensed characters, what we found was that the Quebec French group here in the center had many fewer media characters in their food and beverage advertisements than the other two English groups, half as many. Now, when we went and looked at the food and beverage categories, what we found was that, first of all, the Quebec French group, so again in red here, they saw many fewer candy and snack ads, you can see on the left-hand side, and also many fewer grain ads, which is just the fourth one over here. And in particular, they saw very, very few breakfast cereal ads in the French Quebec sample, so that was one of the big differences. When you look at beverages, though, which is the second column, you can see that the French Quebec kids saw many more beverage ads, particularly yogurt drink ads. So this is a list of the most frequently advertised food categories by group. So these were the top 5 products that we saw in our sample. And so if you look at the 3 columns, you can see that the Quebec French group, the type of ad they're seeing is quite different. Yogurt drinks, yogurt, candy, gum, fruit rolls, fast food restaurants, cheese and cheese tricks. So it's pretty heavily focused on dairy products. The Ontario English and Quebec English, very heavy on the candy and gum, etc. Cold cereal, fast foods. Fast food also appears in the top 3 in the Quebec English, and candy and gum in the first place for both of them here. When we started to look at the nutrients in the foods that we were seeing advertised to these 3 groups, again, we found some significant differences and a real profile started to emerge. So what we found was that the Quebec French group, so they're in red again, their advertisements were higher in total fat, higher in saturated fat, higher in trans fat. I mean, all the levels were very low, though, in trans fats. They were also higher in protein. But the Quebec French ads were much lower in sugar and carbohydrates and also lower in energy compared to the food and beverage promotion seen in the 2 English groups. And then when we looked at the overall healthfulness of the food and beverage ads that were seen by the 3 groups, what we found is that there were statistically significant differences. So the French kids did have more healthful food and beverage ads. You can see 81% in red for the Quebec French there, and 60.5, and you can see what the other 2 groups are there. So this is the 2 different ways that we analyze the data. However, the majority of the foods that showed up in all 3 groups, obviously, still fell into the less healthy range. So although the Quebec French ads were slightly more healthy, the majority is still considered unhealthy. So now in the third study, so just to remind you, this is the study where we compared the companies participating in the CAI and those companies that were not participating in the CAI. We found some big differences again here. First of all, the CAI corporations, so the ones participating in the initiative, we found more food and beverage advertisements, more contests, and more sponsorship announcements than the companies who weren't participating in the initiative. Another thing we looked at was the amount of repetition that was used, because that's sometimes a technique that's used by marketers to kind of reinforce their brand with children, with adults. And what we did here in this table is that these are all the products that were repeated more than 10 times in 87.5 hours. And this 87.5 hours, by the way, is just the preferred viewing that occurred on children's specialty channels. So that's channels like Teletoon and YTV and Family and things like that. So as you can see, the CAI did much more repetition than the non-CAI companies. And some of the products also, I'd say, the majority of products here, unfortunately, fall into the less healthy range. So there was just, Oreo cookies. I mean, SpongeBob fruit snacks repeated 28 times in 87.5 hours. That's a lot of repetition. It's the same ad over and over again. There's no, it's not like there's 3 different ads. It's the same ad. The McDonald's Happy Meal was repeated 32 times. Kraft Dinner 33 times. We also looked at the presence of media characters, and what we found was that the CAI was using media characters more frequently. They were using licensed characters, celebrities more often, and spokes characters more often. So spokes characters are like Snap, Crackle, and Pop. And so overall, when you look at them all together as media characters, the differences between the CAI and the non-CAI were statistically significant. And when we looked at the food categories that they were advertising in, what we found was the CAI was promoting more prepared foods than the non-CAI. That's up in the purple. You can see the purple wedge there. It's very small. And they were also promoting more candy and snacks. So you can see that 46% right here compared to 23% right here. Whereas on the non-CAI side, they were promoting restaurants more at 25%, and it's over here at 12% in orange. And this data was weighted, by the way, by the number, by the areas, the food categories in which they actually manufactured products, so we took that into consideration. When we looked at the average nutrients in the food and beverage promotions, what we found was that the CAI companies, their food and beverage promotions were higher in fat. So the CAI is in blue here. So their promotions were higher in fat, higher in saturated fat, higher in trans fat, higher in carbohydrate, higher in sugar, higher in sodium, and higher in energy. So overall, it wasn't a very good picture. And then when we look globally at the healthfulness of food and beverage promotions, we use that UK nutrient profile model, which I'll just remind you is the model with a mathematical formula where you put in the fat, sugar, salt, vegetable content, nut content, and protein, and it spits out whether it's less healthy or healthier. What we found was that 80% of the CAI products fell into the less healthy category. 20% were in the healthier category, and for the non-CAI, 55% were less healthy. So still a majority for both, although the CAI fared worse in this case. Now, in terms of policy implications in Quebec, first of all, the Consumer Protection Act is having an influence. We're certainly seeing fewer contests and sponsorship announcements that are food and beverage related. We're seeing more beverages, we're seeing fewer candy and snack promotions and fewer breakfast cereal ads. Children are also targeted much less often in Quebec, and media characters are used less often. But where the Consumer Protection Act maybe needs to be strengthened and where it's not having an influence, the French Quebec children were seeing just as many advertisements. Also the healthfulness of the food promotions, it's not really having an impact on that. As I said, the food promotions were healthier in the French Quebec sample, but still the majority of the foods were considered unhealthy. And also the Consumer Protection Act is not protecting children who are not watching TV in in French. It's offering some protection to French Quebecers, but it's not protecting English Quebec children or other children who are watching TV in English. In terms of policy implications in Canada, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative is also having an influence in some areas. Some corporations are not advertising to children at all. So in our total sample of 99.5 hours, there were 4 corporations that did not advertise at all to children. And then when we looked at the 87.5 hour sample, so that was only the children's specialty channels in their preferred viewing, so we got rid of the generalist stations, that number actually went up to 8. So there are 8 corporations not advertising, so that's excellent. And these companies are obviously should be role models to other companies. Also, it is having an influence, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, in that there's little use of licensed characters. So those are the characters, again, that are purchased. Like they're not using Mickey Mouse or Dora the Explorer to try to attract children's attention. In terms of where improvement is needed and where it's not having an influence, the CAI is responsible for significantly more food promotions, more repetition of promotions, and is using media characters, particularly spokes characters. The company created mascots in their food and beverage promotions. Also, foods are higher in fats, in sugar, sodium, and energy compared to other corporations' food and beverage promotions, and a greater number of them are classified as less healthy. Now, in terms of policy recommendations from Canada, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative has been improved significantly in the last year, but there are still many, many corporations that aren't participating. There were 35 corporations in my non-CAI group, and there were 16 originally, and then 17 in my research here in the CAI group. So that's 35 companies that weren't participating in the CAI. And I know the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, they're currently up to 19, but there's still many companies that need to join, and also the nutritional criteria and the audience thresholds are all varying. Each company sets their own limit. So I really feel that federal statutory regulations that restrict unhealthy food and beverages in all media forms and child settings is what's needed in Canada, and this is what's been recommended by the WHO. And what we need are really broad definitions of who children are. The limit in the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative is under 12. In Quebec, it's under 13. The UK has gone with under 16, and I feel that's the better approach, going with under 16, particularly given that in the United States, since self-regulatory initiatives have been begun there have been some pre- and post-studies done, and what they found is that while marketing directed at children has decreased slightly in the United States by about 4%, which is excellent, it's actually increased for teens. So teens are being targeted more, and I think they're a group that's really at risk. I think marketing needs to be defined very broadly and include all child settings. And the way unhealthy food is defined has to be based on nutritional data and current standards. Lastly, systematic monitoring and enforcement is very important. In terms of policy recommendations for Quebec, I think improved monitoring is something that is definitely needed in Quebec. Also an improved enforcement system, particularly given that the fines that are being levied at corporations right now are so low. Also, child viewing times need to be updated. The guidelines that were set back in 1978 reflect when children in 78 were watching TV, and I can tell you that in my sample, 20% of the most popular viewing times was between 8 and 10 p.m. on weekdays, and that's certainly not reflected in the Consumer Protection Act guidelines. We also need to consider extending the Consumer Protection Act to restrict all unhealthy food advertisements, regardless of whether they're child-directed. Kids in Quebec right now are seeing a lot of food and beverage advertising that's directed at adults. And I think if we don't put protections in that look at unhealthy food advertisements, children are going to continue to receive those messages and continue to get the branding, even though the advertisement's not directed at them. I just want to thank all the children and parents who participated in my research study, and CIHR who funded my research. And that is all for today. Thank you very much.